34 felony convictions. And the oath still happened. That is not commentary, that is sequence. A court counted 34 counts of wrongdoing. That ruling went down before he stepped into the Oval Office, before the cameras, before the address, before the flags behind the podium. Conviction first, presidency second. And on national television, Morgan Freeman leaned in and said he can't personally understand how a convicted felon gets to be president. How do you do that? Not shouted, not dramatized, just stated. Here's why that lands differently. He didn't question policy. He didn't debate tax rates or foreign affairs. He questioned coherence. He said, it just doesn't make sense to me. That's not ideology. That's structural confusion spoken calmly. But here's the fracture in the story. The system did not stall. It did not pause. It did not reset. It absorbed the contradiction and kept moving. A legal verdict and executive authority now coexist without canceling each other out. Sequence matters. Because if conviction does not block accession to power, then the boundary we assumed existed has shifted. Quietly, publicly, permanently. This isn't about whether people voted knowingly. It's about what the timeline reveals. The ruling happened before the oath. That fact sits there, unchanged, while the presidency continues. Now the pattern becomes visible. When institutions normalize what once felt incompatible, the definition of exception begins to erode. And when exceptions multiply, they stop being exceptions. They become precedent. So the real instability isn't outrage. It's adaptation. It's how quickly a nation learns to live with what once would have stopped it cold. And if this can be absorbed without rupture, what else can be? The reaction was immediate, and it was louder than the statement itself. Freeman's words went viral within hours. Clips spread across social media. Commentators replayed the line. How do you do that? The phrase became the headline, the caption, the debate trigger. But here's what matters more than the virality. He wasn't speaking in isolation. He sat down with Lawrence O'Donnell, a known critic of Trump, and chose a national platform to frame the presidency through a moral lens. That decision wasn't random. It was timed in a climate already showing strain. Look at the polling landscape. Almost every poll, including those aired on Fox News, shows the president's approval underwater. On one panel, the numbers were blunt. 70% of Americans said he is not trustworthy. 56% said he is not mentally sharp enough to serve. 56% said he is not committed to protecting rights and freedoms. 62% believe he is using the presidency to enrich himself. 65% say he has exceeded his authority. Those are not fringe margins. Those are structural indicators. But here's the destabilizing question. When skepticism reaches that scale and power remains intact, what does that signal about the relationship between perception and consequence? Now the pattern becomes visible. Freeman's critique aligns with polling signals. That alignment is what transforms a celebrity comment into a broader civic echo. It stops being Hollywood speaking out of turn and starts looking like a cultural mirror reflecting existing doubt. And watch what they never addressed. The issue is not whether actors should comment on politics. The issue is why their comments resonate when they do. Resonance requires conditions. It requires a public already leaning toward the edge of uncertainty. This is where control starts slipping. When public trust numbers fall, 70% on trust, 65% on authority, yet institutional power holds firm, tension accumulates quietly. Not explosively, structurally. Freeman's line didn't create that tension. It exposed it. And once exposure happens, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the approval floor keeps eroding, how does the presidency stabilize itself without shifting tactics? Because adaptation is already underway. Here's the first hard strike. The presidency is not just facing criticism. It is facing measurable doubt across multiple fronts at the same time. On Fox News, the numbers were read aloud without spin. 40% approve of his handling of the economy. 59% disapprove. That gap isn't narrow. It's structural. And when approval on the economy drops below majority territory, the traditional anchor of political stability weakens. But look closer. The same broadcast cited a producer price report showing inflation up 2.9% over the last 12 months. The core number, stripping out food and energy, rose 3.6%, the highest reading since March of 2025. Markets reacted immediately. The Dow down 526, the Nasdaq down 235. That's not narrative, that's reaction. Now translate what that means. Inflation running hotter than expected limits the probability of rate cuts. Rate cuts affect valuations. Valuations affect markets. Markets influence consumer confidence. Consumer confidence feeds directly into political durability. Watch what's absent. There's no clear explanation tying these numbers to a confident forward trajectory. Instead, the focus shifts to what they passed with the big, beautiful bill and what the administration believes people will starting to feel as the year progresses. Belief, future tense. But here's the fracture in the timeline. The inflation data is present tense. The market response is present tense. The disapproval numbers are present tense. When forward-looking promises collide with immediate economic pressure, perception doesn't wait. And this is where the pressure compounds. Because the president isn't just managing inflation. He is also preparing to address Iran, Venezuela fallout, Supreme Court reactions, and tariffs, with justices sitting in the front row during the speech. That's not a narrow lane. That's a full plate under strain. So the analytical claim is simple. Skepticism is no longer concentrated in one category. It is diffused. Economy, authority, trust, enrichment concerns, all registering simultaneously. And when multiple pillars weaken at once, stabilization requires more than rhetoric. It requires a shift. The question is whether that shift is strategic or reactive. Something subtle is happening. What once would have triggered institutional alarm is now processed as political weather. A former president this close to a convicted felon was described on air as problematic. The remark drew laughter. Then it moved on. But notice the inversion. The line was meant as irony, yet the reality is sharper. The country doesn't have a former president near a conviction. It has a current president with 34 convictions. That distinction didn't stop the segment. It became part of the rhythm. Now the pattern becomes visible. Normalization doesn't arrive with a headline. It arrives with repetition. A court ruling, an inauguration, viral clips, poll numbers underwater, market declines. And then the next segment begins. This is how abnormal becomes routine. Freeman's statement, "It just doesn't make sense to me," wasn't framed as a constitutional crisis. It was framed as confusion. And confusion, when repeated enough times without rupture, becomes background noise. But here's the fracture. In the same media cycle, questions surfaced about trustworthiness, 70% saying no. About mental sharpness, 56% saying no. About exceeding authority, 65% saying yes. These are not marginal doubts. These are majority signals. And yet, governance continues. When majority skepticism coexists with uninterrupted authority, the public adapts. The definition of political threshold shifts downward. What once might have halted momentum now merely dents it. Look at the response structure. The administration prepares speeches. It emphasizes economic legislation. It weaves in real people as examples. It addresses Iran, Venezuela, tariffs, Supreme Court reactions. The machine keeps moving. That's the shift. The system isn't collapsing under contradiction. It is metabolizing it. And when a system metabolizes contradiction without visible cost, observers recalibrate what they believe is possible. So the escalation isn't dramatic. It's gradual. It's the quiet transition from shock to adjustment. And once adjustment locks in, reversal becomes harder than escalation. Here's where the contradiction sharpens. The same polling cycle that shows 40% approving of the economy also shows 59% disapproving. The same data set that reports 2.9% inflation year over year shows core prices up 3.6%, the highest since March of 2025. The Dow down 526, the Nasdaq down 235. Markets still debate ideology. They price risk. But here's the pivot. 62% believe the president is using the presidency to enrich himself. What gave it away? One commentator asked. The Qatari jet. That detail matters, because when enrichment narratives enter mainstream polling at majority levels, perception shifts from policy disagreement to motive suspicion. And motive suspicion is harder to reverse than economic downturns. Now look at the contradiction. The administration prepares to focus on the economy in a major address. It plans to emphasize what was passed, described as the big, beautiful bill. It intends to highlight consumer confidence numbers improving as the year progresses. Future relief, present strain. But watch the gap between words and numbers. Inflation is current. Market reaction is current. Disapproval is current. Yet the stabilizing language relies on expectation, what people will feel later. This is where control starts thinning. Because when economic data undercuts narrative timing, the credibility gap widens. And that gap feeds directly into those trust numbers. 70% saying not trustworthy. Here's the reframing line. When economic pressure and integrity doubts rise together, the presidency stops fighting one fire and starts managing a convergence. That convergence is more dangerous than any single controversy. And it's not happening in isolation. Iran, Venezuela fallout, Supreme Court tensions, tariffs, all on the same agenda. Stacked variables, tight margins, elevated skepticism. The question isn't whether criticism exists. The question is, how many pressure points can align before momentum shifts from resistance to acceleration? Because once convergence begins, it rarely pauses on command. Now, the tempo changes. Inflation running at 2.9%. Core at 3.6%, highest since March 2025. Markets dropping. Approval on the economy stuck at 40%. Disapproval at 59%. Trust numbers collapsing. 62% suspecting enrichment. 65% saying authority has been exceeded. Individually, these are problems. Together, they form velocity. Add the foreign policy layer. Iran on the agenda. Fallout from Venezuela. Tariffs reacting to Supreme Court scrutiny, with justices sitting in the front row during a presidential address. That visual matters. Power speaking while oversight watches. Stack it. Economic strain, judicial tension, foreign policy volatility, majority skepticism. But here's the fracture in the rhythm. None of it has produced visible institutional slowdown. The speech is still delivered. The market's still open. The administration still advances its narrative of what people will feel as the year progresses. This is where the pattern hardens. When pressure accumulates without immediate rupture, observers begin testing boundaries. How much disapproval can coexist with executive authority? How many majority doubts can exist without structural correction? Now the pattern becomes visible. The system isn't responding to one crisis. It's absorbing multiple signals simultaneously. Economic, legal, civic, cultural, and projecting continuity. That projection is strength, or strain, because velocity doesn't announce itself as collapse. It announces itself as acceleration. Events begin stacking faster than reassurance can neutralize them. And here's the escalating question. If inflation remains elevated, if approval remains underwater, if skepticism about motive remains above 60%, and if institutional tension with courts intensifies, what mechanism slows the convergence? What happens if this doesn't slow down? Now bring this down from the podium to your kitchen table. Inflation at 2.9%, core at 3.6%, markets sliding hundreds of points in a morning. Those numbers don't stay on a screen. They move into mortgage rates, credit card interest, grocery totals, business hiring decisions. When 40% approve of the economy and 59% don't, that split isn't abstract. It reflects how people feel walking into stores, checking retirement accounts, opening bills. And here's where it becomes personal. If 62% believe the presidency is being used for enrichment, that perception doesn't just criticize leadership. It reshapes trust in outcomes. Every policy choice is filtered through suspicion. Every economic bump is interpreted as advantage for someone else. That shifts behavior. People delay purchases. Businesses hedge. Investors pull back. Confidence becomes cautious. Caution slows momentum. Now the pattern touches daily life. 70% saying not trustworthy. 56% questioning mental sharpness. 65% saying authority has been exceeded. When those numbers circulate, they influence how citizens interpret news, speeches, promises. It's not ideology. It's psychological climate. And here's the destabilizing detail. Governance continues as if the skepticism is background noise. You feel that tension. The system projects stability. The data projects doubt. The markets project volatility. When those three signals diverge, ordinary people absorb the gap. If this feels close to home, say that in the comments. Because the collision isn't theoretical, it's experiential. It shows up in cost, in confidence, in conversation. And when daily life begins carrying the weight of institutional contradiction, patience shortens. Adaptation has limits. Step back. What allows this to hold together? A legal ruling of 34 counts of wrongdoing. Approval on the economy at 40%. Disapproval at 59. 70% saying not trustworthy. 65% saying authority has been exceeded. Markets reacting to 3.6% core inflation. Yet the presidency remains operational, televised, scheduled, structured. The mechanism is institutional elasticity. Modern political systems are built to absorb shock without immediate fracture. Courts issue rulings, elections proceed, media cycles spin, speeches are delivered. Even when tension rises, the framework keeps functioning. That continuity creates a powerful illusion. If it hasn't broken, it must be stable. But here's the unsettling insight. Stability and strain can coexist for long periods. Elastic systems stretch before they snap. And while stretching, they appear intact. Notice how the response pattern works. Criticism surfaces, from actors, from commentators, from polling data. The administration counters with legislative messaging, economic framing, forward-looking optimism about what people will feel as the year progresses. Markets fluctuate. Another news segment begins. Cycle repeats. Now the pattern becomes visible. The system doesn't require unanimous trust to function. It requires enough procedural continuity to maintain motion. As long as elections are held, courts convene, speeches occur, and markets open, the machinery signals normalcy. But perception shifts underneath. When majority skepticism about trust, authority, and motive becomes embedded, the elasticity is tested from within. Not through one dramatic event, but through accumulated doubt. And accumulated doubt changes how future events are interpreted. The presidency doesn't fall because of one statement. It shifts because of layered perception. And when layered perception reaches critical density, the next disruption, economic, legal, geopolitical, lands on already stretched ground. That's the mechanism. It doesn't explode, it stretches. Now look forward. Two paths are forming. Path 1, stabilization through recalibration. Inflation cools from 2.9%. Core drops from 3.6%. Markets recover from triple-digit losses. Approval on the economy climbs above 40%. Trust numbers soften. Skepticism about enrichment falls below 62%. The narrative of what people will feel as the year progresses begins matching what they actually feel. If that happens, elasticity holds. The stretch relaxes. The contradiction becomes a footnote in a broader recovery story. But here's the second path. Inflation remains elevated. Core stays near that highest reading since March 2025. Markets continue reacting sharply. Approval remains underwater at 40%. Disapproval stays near 60%. Trust remains at 70% saying no. Authority concerns stay at 65% saying yes. Under that scenario, perception doesn't just linger, it compounds. And here's the acceleration factor. When economic strain intersects with motive suspicion, 62% believing enrichment, and authority skepticism, 65% saying overreach, each new headline lands heavier than the last. Now the pattern becomes visible. Velocity increases when doubt stacks faster than reassurance. No certainty here. No prediction of collapse. Just momentum. Because systems under sustained skepticism either recalibrate visibly or absorb pressure until a new equilibrium forms. The next economic report. The next court decision. The next foreign policy flashpoint involving Iran or Venezuela. Each one interacts with existing perception. That interaction determines direction. The presidency isn't standing still. It's moving along one of these trajectories in real time. The question is not which path is more dramatic. The question is which path gathers speed. 34 convictions did not stop the oath. That single fact reframes everything. Not because it proves collapse, not because it guarantees crisis, but because it reveals something deeper about modern power. Legality, perception, and authority no longer move in automatic alignment. A court issued a ruling before the inauguration. Polls show 40% approving of the economy, 59% disapproving. 70% say not trustworthy. 62% suspect enrichment. 65% say authority has been exceeded. Core inflation hits 3.6%. Markets fall hundreds of points in a morning. And yet the presidency continues. Here's the insight that lingers. The most powerful systems don't break when contradictions appear. They redefine what counts as contradiction. They stretch until coexistence becomes the new baseline. A convicted president and uninterrupted executive power now share the same frame. That coexistence changes the psychological threshold of what Americans consider possible. This story isn't about one actor speaking out. It isn't about one speech or one economic report. It's about how quickly a country adjusts when boundaries shift in plain sight. And once adjustment happens, reversal becomes harder than acceptance. So the next time you hear a number, 2.9% inflation, 3.6% core, 40% approval, 70% distrust, don't just hear the statistic. Ask what it's building toward, because the trajectory isn't shaped by outrage. It's shaped by accumulation. And accumulation, over time, redraws the map. If you want to track where that map leads next, not through noise, but through pattern, subscribe. The velocity hasn't peaked. It's forming.